Hi everyone, so now we're going to do the digestive system. I'm going to start with an overview of anatomy. We're going to talk about the layers of the intestinal wall, like we've seen before in anatomy. We'll talk about neural and hormonal regulation, and then we're just going to work our way through the GI tract, starting with the mouth and going all the way through. Okay, so let's do it. So when we look at the digestive system, there are two major functions of the digestive system. The first is the one that we all remember, digestive system, to digest, to break things down. So we're going to take our macromolecules and digest them into their pieces, their monomers. As we do that, please think about the two different types of digestion. We have physical digestion and we have chemical digestion. Physical digestion is things like denaturing proteins or using bile to break big fat droplets into smaller fat droplets. Whereas chemical digestion means that we're going to be breaking covalent bonds. So if you are not breaking covalent bonds, that would be physical digestion, not chemical. Okay, chemical needs to break those covalent bonds, and in order to do that, you're going to need some enzymes. So that's the one that we usually remember, digestive system for digestion. We also need to remember that once you digest those nutrients, you need to bring them into the body, and so that would be absorption. Okay, so digest and then absorb, bringing them into the blood so that we can take them to our cells, so we can use them for nutrients so we can make ATP. Okay, so this is just a list of digestive systems. We're going to be working our way through the GI tract. I am also going to hit on a couple of the accessory organs, so not on the pathway for the food, but do contribute to the digestion or absorption of that food. We're going to talk about the salivary glands. We'll talk about the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas. Okay, so for the GI tract is organized into layers, okay, or tunics. Okay, so the innermost one is called the mucosa. The mucosa is going to be where in contact where the food is, and so that's going to include things like villi, microvilli. That is the mucosa. Under the mucosa, we have the submucosa, sub as in below it, and that's where you're going to find a lot of the glands. You'll find nerves running through it, lots of blood vessels. So this right here, this would be the submucosa. And then deep to that, we have the muscularis, or also known as the muscularis externa. And that is going to be layers of smooth muscle for contractions to move things along. Most of the GI tract will have two layers. You'll have a layer that's organized like a circle for squeezing, and then a layer organized longitudinally for pushing. And that is going to be the muscularis externa. Now, there is one additional layer in the stomach. That third layer in the stomach will be what's called an oblique layer, and that is going to be for churning, for moving things around. Okay, so the purpose of the muscularis is to have contractions of smooth muscle for the purpose of moving things along or for mixing. Okay, so we'll come back to that when we talk about peristalsis and segmentation. And then the very, very outside, we have a serous membrane that's known as the serosa, also known as the visceral peritoneum. That is going to be just the outer layer there for protection. Okay, so quick anatomy review there. Okay, so now let's talk about how we regulate activity of the digestive system. We're going to talk about neural control as well as a few hormones, so a little bit of hormonal control too. For our digestive system, we have a lot of neurons in our digestive system, and they create a network, right? So over 100 million neurons interconnecting, synapsing together. So if you've heard of the term gut brain, that refers to the enteric nervous system. Okay, so the enteric nervous system, that is the system of neurons that control or help control the activities of your digestive system. So when we look at the enteric nervous system, it's what we call semi-autonomous. So if autonomous means that it is all by itself, semi-autonomous means it is partially by itself. So the autonomous part of that would refer to what we call short reflexes, also known as intrinsic reflexes, where we have sensory information coming in, and then we have an automatic response by those enteric neurons creating a response. Okay, so those are going to be short reflexes because the digestive system itself is sensing and then having a response directly sort of in-house. Now, the digestive system is also influenced by the central nervous system. Okay, so we call that either long reflex or also known as an extrinsic reflex, where the information is traveling to the central nervous system, then the central nervous system kind of decides what to do. So the control center would be the central nervous system in this point. And then we're going to use the autonomic nervous system to trigger a response in the digestive system. Okay, so let's talk about the autonomic nervous system. For those of you remembering your anatomy, so if you look at the motor pathways, we have the autonomic nervous system regulating sort of things that are done without your voluntary control, so as opposed to the somatic nervous system, which controls your skeletal muscles, right? Your voluntary contractions. The autonomic nervous system controls things like heart rate and things like that. It also has a big influence on the activity of the digestive system. Okay, so generally speaking, and there are some exceptions that I'm going to point out, but generally speaking, the parasympathetic nervous system is going to stimulate activity in the digestive system, and the sympathetic nervous system is going to suppress it. Okay, so for those of you reminding yourself of anatomy, the phrases we usually use are rest and digest for the parasympathetic nervous system, and then fight or flight. Okay, so that rest and digest, the digest part of the parasympathetic nervous system, that refers to stimulating activity in the digestive system. Okay, so most of the time the parasympathetic nervous system will stimulate. The sympathetic nervous system is going to inhibit. Not every time, but most of the time. Okay, so we're also going to talk a little bit about hormonal control of the digestive system, and these are going to be not using the endocrine glands that you've probably seen in anatomy, but what are called enteroendocrine glands. These are going to be organs that are part of the digestive system itself, secreting hormones into the bloodstream that then come back and affect that organ, or sometimes an organ part of that, another organ in the digestive system. So we're going to look at 3 hormones today. One of them is secreted from the stomach, and then that hormone is then going to come back and influence the stomach, but also influence the small intestine as well. Okay, so they are going to be hormones going into the bloodstream and then coming back to regulate activity within the digestive system. Okay, so we're going to talk about 3 of them today. Okay, let's start our way all the way through. Let's start with the oral cavity. The oral cavity, also known as the mouth, is mostly for digestion, but we want to remember that there are 2 different types of digestion. We have physical digestion and we have chemical. What was the difference between those 2? So for chemical digestion, that means we are going to be breaking apart covalent bonds. If you're not breaking apart covalent bonds, if the molecule is still intact, the macromolecule is still intact, that would be a form of physical digestion. So in the mouth, because of your teeth, you have mastication, which is a fancy way of saying chewing. And so that would be an example of a physical digestion because the macromolecules themselves are still intact. But also happening in the mouth is our very first example of chemical digestion, because in our saliva, we have two different types of enzymes. We have salivary amylase, which is involved in digesting carbohydrates, and we have lingual lipase, which has a very small role in digesting lipids. We'll come back to that. Okay, so let's look at that saliva. So in our mouths, we have, wrong word. We have 3 salivary glands that are going to secrete saliva into our oral cavity. And the 3 glands are the parotid gland, the sublingual gland, and the submandibular gland. You probably learned that in anatomy. I am not going to directly ask you any of those names, but those are the ones that we're talking about. These 3 glands, they secrete a watery solution into our mouths that we call saliva. And in that saliva, we have digestive enzymes. The one that I want you to know is salivary amylase. Okay, so salivary amylase is going to be involved in digesting carbohydrates. And so that will be our very first form of chemical digestion, because we will break apart the covalent bond holding those monomers together into smaller molecules. Okay, so let's talk about control of saliva release, right? So this is going to have both intrinsic and extrinsic stimulation, but I want to focus on the stimulation from the autonomic nervous system, because this is an interesting example where our typical relationship of one says go, one says stop doesn't apply. Okay, so usually the parasympathetic nervous system stimulates the digestive system and the sympathetic nervous system inhibits it. But in this case, we have an example where both divisions of the autonomic nervous system are stimulating the release of saliva, but what changes is what's in the saliva. Okay, so for the parasympathetic nervous system, it's going to stimulate the release of saliva that is watery and has a lot of enzymes. Okay, so that is going to happen when you smell food or think about food, or if there's food in your mouth, that is going to stimulate the release of watery rich enzymes in order to digest that food. The sympathetic nervous system also stimulates the release of saliva, but it's a different type of saliva, because what it does is it stimulates the release of saliva with a lot of mucin in it. Mucin is like mucus. So if you had a job interview, you get that dry mouth, that cottony mouth, you're kind of foamy. That is because of the sympathetic nervous system causing your body to secrete very thick mucin-rich saliva. Okay, so again, both are saying release saliva. What changes is what's in that saliva, depending on the needs, right? So parasympathetic nervous system, donuts. Sympathetic nervous system, a job interview. Okay. So once we have chewed our food, we've mixed it with the saliva, we create what's called a bolus, which just means a ball of food, all partially digested in there. And then we're going to swallow it. The first thing that's going to happen is the tongue is going to move the food to the back of the mouth. That phase is a voluntary reaction, right? We have the conscious thought, or maybe not conscious, but the voluntary thought of swallowing. Once it's in the pharynx, the back of the mouth, though, we now move to 2 involuntary phases. The first is called the pharyngeal phase, where the uvula, which is the dangly part in the back of your mouth, it's going to swing up and block your nose, right, nasal cavity. At the same time, the epiglottis is going to cover the larynx so you don't choke, and that is going to allow it to move back. Okay, so this second one here is the pharyngeal phase. And then once it's in, after the pharyngeal phase, the food will then move into the esophagus. And that's where we're going to move into the esophagus and do something called peristalsis. Okay, so the esophagus is just a muscular tube It is lined with stratified squamous epithelium, which is the same stuff that makes up your skin. So it's not good for absorption or secretion. So no digestion occurs in the esophagus and no absorption occurs. It's just moving the food along. And now we're going to see our first example of peristalsis. And peristalsis refers to movements, rhythmic contractions of smooth muscle in order to move the food along through the digestive system. So this occurs not just in the esophagus, but throughout the remaining regions of the digestive system. Okay, so remember I was saying that in the muscularis, you have two layers. You have one that's circular and one that's longitudinal. So we're going to create these waves of contraction where we have squeezing of it followed by contraction of the longitudinal layer. So we squeeze and push, squeeze and push, squeeze and push, and then together they create the contractions that move the food along. If you want to see a video of real peristalsis in action, not in the esophagus, it's actually in the large intestine, but it's the same idea. This is a really cool video. It also has a nice soundtrack. So I like that video. Okay, so question number one, and I'm obviously not going to be collecting this, but question number one, just to think about it. How might stress influence what's in the composition of your saliva? Okay, so think back to those two divisions. What type of saliva is secreted when you're doing your fight or flight response? Okay, so first of all, which division would that be involved? And how does it affect your saliva? Okay, so I want you to stop and think about it before you move on. Okay, hopefully you thought about it. Okay, so if you are under stress, your sympathetic nervous system is going to be activated. That sends information to your salivary glands, and it's going to make your saliva thicker because it's going to have a lot more mucin in it. It'll have fewer enzymes and less water. Okay, so a more viscous solution. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording and start a new one.